Good evening, everyone. We will wait a few more minutes to welcome more into the room, and then we'll begin at around 6:05. So feel free to get some water or use the bathroom before we begin. And this event will be going on starting around 6:05 until 8:15. We're thrilled that you can join us tonight. Sharing, welcome again to everyone for joining us tonight. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. 5. All right. Good evening and immense gratitude to everyone for joining us tonight for Transforming CUNY Admissions Studies Movements with ASL interpretation by Andrea and Brandon. And it's being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. This is the sixth of 7 online public events for the November through January residency, radiating Black, Puerto Rican, feminist studies from the City University of New York to the Americas and the Caribbean, being coordinated with the Brooklyn Community Center Wendy's Subway. We're receiving support from the CUNY Graduate Center's Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative from the Center for the Humanities, and the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Also at Brooklyn College, the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities, the Africana Studies Department, American Studies Program, and Puerto Rican and Latino Studies Department. Also at City College, the Latin American and Latino Studies Program. And I want to give a shout out that There is a forthcoming anthology called 50 Years of Puerto Rican Studies at CUNY, co-edited by Maria Perez y Gonzalez and Virginia Sanchez Corol, which I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for, and in which you can find out more in the chat, some links that will be shared. My name is Connor Tomas Reed, welcoming all pronouns. I currently teach at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York, and I organize with Free CUNY and Rank and File Action, or RAFA. I wish to thank tonight's participants, Gisely Colón López, Ricardo Gabriel, Tami Gold, Amaka Okechukwu, Pam Sporn, and Anna Zeemont, as well as the Wendy's Subway team, in particular, Rachel Valinsky, Sunny Ayer, and Talene, and all of you out there for joining us tonight for this powerful event. I invite everyone now to share in the chat where you're connecting from so we can learn how far and wide we're reaching towards each other. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm reaching to you from the homeland of the Lenape and Canarsie people, which is and always has been a place of indigenous movement. Our work today and ongoing, at its most fundamental level, is in solidarity with the Lenape, Canarsie, and all indigenous peoples, here and beyond, whose land was stolen to create settler states, and who continue to live under siege, surveillance, and colonial structural violence on their own occupied land. We align with all those advancing indigenous resurgence and decolonization in the face of colonial oppression. We support the return of their lands. This acknowledgement is a call to commit and to take on the responsibility to dismantle the ongoing effects of settler colonialism. This is where, together, we must begin and persist. In the vast work of decolonization, one critical focus is on the terrain of learning institutions like CUNY. The answer to the question, who teaches what to whom, on which land, should never be taken for granted, or only answered by those who oversee the institution. As we will hear tonight, even though CUNY was a haven for Eastern European Jewish anti-fascist radicals in the early 20th century, and later featured principled civil rights organizing in the 50s and 70s, it was still otherwise highly segregated by the late 1960s. During this time, a small but mighty cohort of Black and Puerto Rican students and faculty, with support from anti-racist Euro-American students and faculty, began to demand fundamental changes in admissions, curriculum, and more across the university. They built campus and community coalitions. They occupied buildings. They researched and debated pedagogies, and beyond. Ultimately, these people envisioned another CUNY, and then they created it. And some of them we're very happy to see are with us tonight. Mass desegregation via the open admissions policy in 1970 and the co-emergence of Black, Latinx, Asian, and gender and sexuality studies were won through these struggles. And I'm proud to say that my mother, a Bronx Boricua named Iris Villarreal, studied nursing at Hunter College from 1972 to 76 as a result. These legacies have shaped waves of CUNY struggles in the 80s and 90s, the 2010s, and the present, as well as nationwide educational policies ever since. But with any social movement victory comes ruling elite backlash, such as tuition being imposed in 1976 and open admissions ending in 1999. So tonight features stories of both progress and setbacks. I encourage us to learn from these dynamics in order to continue the collective work to transform CUNY in our own turbulent times. I'm honored to introduce tonight's participants. I'll read their bios, then we'll hear the filmmakers introduce Making the Impossible Possible, followed by its screening. Then we'll hear 3 presentations on CUNY history about tonight's themes, followed by a brief report on a current admissions campaign at the CUNY Graduate Center. Don't worry, we'll have ample time afterwards for question, answers, and dialogue. During the film, we'll disable the chat, but I encourage you all to write down questions and reflections to share at the end. Gisely Colón López was born in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and raised in New York City. As an educator and activist, her work fuses her lived experiences. Gisely is an alum of Brooklyn College and currently a PhD student in urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center. She is also a member of the Alliance for Puerto Rican Education and Empowerment, or APRI. Tami Gold is a Hunter College professor and filmmaker. Her films have consistently been at the forefront of social justice, focusing on issues of race, gender, sexual identity, labor, and police brutality, and screened at the MoMA, Whitney, Chicago Arts Institute, the Kennedy Center, Sundance, Tribeca, and the New York Film Festival. She is a recipient of the Rockefeller, Guggenheim, and Fulbright Fellowships. Pam Sporn is an award-winning filmmaker who taught in New York City high schools for 28 years. Her films have screened on PBS and at US and international film festivals. Some of her films include Detroit 48202, Cuban Roots Bronx Stories, and With a Stroke of the Chaveta. Pam is a member of New Day Films and the Bronx Filmmakers Collective and New York Women in Films and Television. Ricardo Gabriel was born on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people in what is now known as Brooklyn, New York, to working class parents from Yauco and Arecibo, Puerto Rico. He is a PhD candidate in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. He earned his bachelor's degree in Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies at Hunter College, where he was an also active member of the Student Liberation Action Movement, or SLAM. His research interests include social movements, decolonial education, and climate justice. His work focuses on the role of education in struggles for decolonization and radical social change. Ricardo's dissertation examines the movement for Puerto Rican studies at the City University of New York during the 60s and 70s, and he focuses on how movement participants challenged colonial discourses in higher education and sought to advance emancipatory knowledges and practices. He has taught at Fordham University and CUNY. Amaka Okechukwu is an interdisciplinary scholar engaged in research on social movements, race, Black communities, and urban politics. She is an assistant professor of sociology at George Mason University. Okechukwu completed her PhD in sociology from New York University. She formerly served as the oral historian and associate archivist at Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York, and as the project coordinator of the Voices of Crown Heights Oral History Collection and affiliated public engagement at Brooklyn Historical Society. She is the author of the award-winning book that just came out in 2019, To Fulfill These Rights, Political Struggle Over Affirmative Action and Open Admissions. And you can see a link to get a discounted copy in the chat. She has been a member of or worked closely with organizations such as Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, the Brecht Forum, Brooklyn Movement Center, the Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership, and more. We'll finally hear from Anna Zeemont, who is an English PhD candidate and Gittell Urban Studies Dissertation Fellow at the CUNY Graduate Center, where she studies composition rhetoric and American studies. Across CUNY, she's served as a composition instructor, Writing Across the Curriculum Fellow, Writing Center Consultant, and New Media Lab Research Fellow. Anna's research draws on queer, feminist, decolonial, and abolitionist frameworks to interrogate the politics, rhetorics, and movement of literacy across educational institutions and urban geographies. Her dissertation traces 1990s CUNY activist literacies as interventions into neoliberal racial capitalism and intersecting oppression with and beyond the university. Before starting her PhD, Anna worked in secondary education in the Bay Area, where she grew up. So we'll now get to hear from Gisely, Pam, and Tami, who will three introduce the film, and then we will screen Making the Impossible Possible.
Gracias, Connor. I'm Gisely Colón López. Thank you for that awesome introduction, and I'm so appreciative to be sharing space here with all of you tonight. My connection to this film exists because I am an alum of the Puerto Rican and Latino Studies Department at Brooklyn College. And because I am a member of an intergenerational movement I endearingly refer to as APRE. As a student at Brooklyn College, I began to research and write about the origins of the department. While this movement to transform and decolonize the academic space is part of a larger CUNY-wide and bi-coastal movement demanding similar changes, I quickly realized this site of struggle was as peripheral within scholarship as the physical location of the campus building. The Department of Puerto Rican Studies is one of the epicenters for the birth of ethnic studies in this country. I'd like to acknowledge all of the pioneering student activists that are in the audience right now, and current faculty and students that are currently teaching or studying with the department today. It's very exciting to have been part of this film project we are screening tonight. It's the story told by the pioneering student activists themselves. I invite you all to learn more about the Alliance for Puerto Rican Education and Empowerment, APRE. Our mission is to advocate for social transformation through programs focused on education and the advancement of the Puerto Rican community. Our membership consists of many of the pioneering student activists you'll hear from in the film. The film project developed as a generative extension of APRE's educational programs and initiatives. Core to them is the Not a White Paper, a document that you can find on our website, apree.org, apre.org. It was created because APRE members agreed this history is still relevant today. We agree today is still a moment to be even more creative and bold. APRE wants young people to know that their stories matter and that they can be used to change the world. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Gisely. So I'm Pam Sporn. I'm one of the filmmakers, co-directed Making the Impossible Possible with Tami Gold. And I'm so appreciative of having been invited to work on this project by folks that knew Tami and I as activists, so that our connection to this work as filmmakers flows from being in struggle actually around Palestine with some of the members of APRE. So we were invited in to do this project. My particular connection and why I feel so committed to the ideas that are and the stories that are told in this film is that when I first started teaching as a recent bilingual education grad from NYU way back in 1978, I got a job at Park East High School in East Harlem. And one of the classes that I was given to teach was history of Puerto Rico. And I was so lucky. I wasn't taught the history of Puerto Rico in my classes at NYU, but I was so lucky to have a friend named Elisam Escobar who had been teaching history of Puerto Rico at that very same school before me. And he passed on to me his lesson plans for teaching that course. And so I feel that working on this film was kind of a return to some of my early learnings about the history of Puerto Rico. And so I'll pass it on to Tami. We had a great time working on this. We were so inspired by all of the activists, the former activists and continuing activists whose stories we recorded for this, and so inspired by all of the archival material that we found as well.
Hi, I'm Tami, And again, just like everyone's been saying, thank you so much for including us in what's a critical series of panel discussions around higher public education, which we need to all embrace and save at this historic moment when it's on the chopping block. I came to the film, as Pam explained, as an activist because Esther came to us, and Esther's here with us. Esther Farmer, raise your hand. Esther came to us and said, would you be interested in doing something that speaks to the history, the 50-year history of the struggle for the Department of Puerto Rican Studies at Brooklyn College? So we began the discussion there. And naturally, some of us who work on films really ask, why should I tell this story? I'm not Puerto Rican. I was in the Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee. I've always fought for the independence of Puerto Rico. But as a non-Puerto Rican, why should I tell this story? And it was a real experience of collaboration, of a collective process, and of an embracing process. And what I learned in making it are the wonderful stories, but what's most important that I learned is the intergenerational spirit that went into the struggle at Brooklyn College. And you'll see in the film, it was also an alliance between Black and Puerto Rican and Latino students. And this we have to celebrate and bring out in all the work we do, and not forget and use it as a milestone for our current organizing. So thank you again.
All right. Just wanting to echo what everyone has said. Thank you for such an incredible film. And we're so honored to have many of the participants in these struggles who are with us tonight. I want to give gratitude for you sharing space with us. We'll get to hear from the three presenters, starting with Ricardo. You have the floor.
Okay, good evening. Thank you, Connor, Wendy Subway, and all the co-sponsors for organizing this event. Thank you, Tami, Pam, and Gisely for sharing your film. I watched it 3 times now, and it's an honor to be here with you and the participants who are here with us tonight. The film celebrates the 50th anniversary of Puerto Rican Studies at Brooklyn College. And as Connor mentioned, there's a book being published by the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, edited by Maria Perez y Gonzalez and Virginia Sanchez Carroll, commemorating 50 years of Puerto Rican Studies at CUNY. This is an important moment for Puerto Rican Studies. Some of our institutions are in transition, and there's a lot of important work being done both by the OGs, the elders and veterans of the movement, and by younger generations of scholars and activists. There's a lot of exciting scholarship on the Puerto Rican left in particular that has come out recently. And there's also innovative Puerto Rican studies projects taking place outside of and adjacent to the academy that are equally important in my opinion. Teaching for Change recently published its 3rd edition of Caribbean Connections, Puerto Rico, a curricular guide for middle and high school teachers, and its editor, Maria Jimenez Garcia, is working with teachers in Pennsylvania to help them incorporate Puerto Rican studies into their classrooms. The Puerto Rico syllabus is another much needed project of public scholarship, helping us understand the overlapping political, economic, and ecological crises facing Puerto Rico. So I encourage folks to seek out those resources. My dissertation, which is still in progress, examines the movement for Puerto Rican studies at CUNY from the late 1960s to the mid 1970s, which extended throughout the CUNY system. The most well-known sites were Brooklyn College and City College, but there were organizations and struggles at Queens College, Hunter College, Lehman, Baruch, and elsewhere. So I'm analyzing archival records and collecting oral histories from people who participated as students, faculty, and administrators. The purpose of my research is to better understand how the Puerto Rican student movement and the demand for Puerto Rican studies were connected to larger social movements for educational justice and self-determination, and how the initial pedagogical political project of Puerto Rican studies can provide insight into the nature of decolonial education. But before I get into that, I want to talk briefly about how I come to this work because it relates to the themes of tonight's event and the film. As an undergraduate at Hunter College, I majored in Africana and Puerto Rican Latino studies, and was an active member of SLAM. The Puerto Rican, Caribbean, and Black Studies courses I took had a profound impact on me because it was the first time in more than 12 years of schooling that I realized that my history and culture were valid fields of study. And it was the first time I saw the communities I was a part of reflected in the classroom. Once I got to graduate school, I started to study the movement history more closely. I realized that both my mother and aunt, who were the first in my family to attend college, actually took classes in Puerto Rican studies at Brooklyn and Hunter College in the 1970s. They both went on to work for the New York City Department of Education for many years. I mention all this to highlight the transformational potential of Puerto Rican studies, Black studies, and ethnic studies, and to say that I am among the many, many working class students of color indebted to those who struggled for open admissions and for culturally and socially relevant education at CUNY. So how do we understand the movement for Puerto Rican studies in a larger context? The first point I want to make is that Puerto Rican student activism, including the call for Puerto Rican studies, had its roots in educational struggles at the K-12 level that were led by teachers, community activists, and parents, mostly women. This has been written about, but it's not said enough. In fact, the first calls for classes in Puerto Rican history and culture in New York City were made in the mid-20th century, and this is well documented in Sonia Nieto's book, Puerto Rican Students in US Schools. Many of the students calling for Puerto Rican studies were previously involved in or influenced by Aspira and Antonia Pantoja, and of course, Evelina Antonetti, leader of the United Bronx Parents, and other Puerto Rican and African American grassroots organizers were demanding bilingual education, improved educational conditions, and community control over public schools around the same time. So there was already an important history of Puerto Rican educational activism in 1969. It's important to realize that Puerto Rican student activism at CUNY exploded throughout New York City just 6 years after Nathan Glazer and Daniel Moynihan in 1963 described Puerto Rican culture and family life as, quote, sadly defective in their highly influential report, Beyond the Melting Pot. And 4 years after Oscar Lewis in 1965 portrayed Puerto Rican families in New York as being indifferent towards education and stuck in a, quote, culture of poverty. So Puerto Rican student activism and Puerto Rican studies scholarship was responding directly and indirectly to the racist discourses in social science and the media at the time. The Black student movement, which was national in scope, and the Black Panther Party, the anti-war movement, and SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, were other major influences on the Puerto Rican student movement, and the film captures this as well. The Puerto Rican student movement, like the movements that emerged from the Black, Chicana, Indigenous, and Asian American communities, were intertwined with larger radical movements by people of color in the United States during the late 1960s, often referred to collectively as the Third World Left. And these movements were inspired and influenced by the anti-colonial and national liberation movements erupting throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America, including the Puerto Rican independence movement and the struggle and the student movement at the University of Puerto Rico. This also is well documented. And so I find it somewhat puzzling when the Puerto Rican student movement is described solely through the lens of civil rights. Civil rights organizations and struggles certainly helped lay the foundation for the movement, and some of its demands can be considered within the realm of civil rights, but students weren't just asking for equal access and inclusion. They were very intentionally trying to transform the university into a more democratic and collectively governed institution. Even the Young Lords have been described as a, quote, Latino civil rights group at times. So this 50-year anniversary is a good opportunity to rekindle our collective radical imagination and reclaim the legacy of radical Puerto Rican organizing in New York and the larger diaspora. Lastly, we need to understand the struggle for Puerto Rican studies in the context of the United States colonial relationship with Puerto Rico, especially since education was used to advance the US colonial project in Puerto Rico and attempt to Americanize the population. This is well summarized by Samuel McCune Lindsay, the Director of Education for Puerto Rico in 1902, when he said, quote, colonization carried forward by the armies of war is vastly more costly than that carried forward by the armies of peace, whose outposts and garrisons are the public schools. So let's think about the significance of working class migrants from the US's largest colony, challenging colonial education in one of the country's preeminent public universities, and laying the groundwork for a new field of study with a critique of US empire at its heart. That's what Puerto Rican Studies is. And in my work, I analyze some of the intellectual contributions of early Puerto Rican Studies scholarship. So I'll end by sharing some thoughts on the relevance of Puerto Rican Studies today. 2 weeks ago, on January 6th, before the fascist pro-Trump mob attacked the Capitol, Puerto Rico was trending on Twitter, and not because it was Three Kings Day. Puerto Rico was trending because it was becoming clear that the two Democrats from Georgia were going to win their Senate races, and Democrats and liberals were salivating at the prospect of gaining a larger majority in the Senate if Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico were to become states. Liberals and even some progressives have been calling for Puerto Rican statehood for months out of their own selfish desire for political power. This is because on November 6th, Puerto Rico held its own election for governor and seats in the Puerto Rican legislature. And on the ballot was also a question, a so-called referendum on the country's status. It asked, quote, should Puerto Rico be immediately admitted into the Union as a state? And voters could answer either yes or no. 52.34% of the people who answered that question voted yes. 47.66% voted no. But only about 50% of the electorate turned out that day. It was a historically low turnout. There were a lot of other very important things that happened during that election, including surprisingly strong support for the two anti-neoliberal pro-decolonization parties, the Puerto Rican Independence Party and the Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, but that's beyond the scope of my talk. My point is that only about a quarter of all eligible voters, just 25%, actually voted in favor of statehood in November. That's hardly a mandate, but the way the corporate media in the US is talking about it, you would think there was a clear, overwhelming demand for statehood, but that's not true. It's a distortion. Most of the people aligned with the Democratic Party know little about Puerto Rico or Puerto Rican history, but they talk about giving us statehood as if they know what's best for us. This is the type of patronizing colonial discourse and treatment that Puerto Rican Studies was founded to confront. But we as a field have been silent on this for the most part. In September, Joy Ann Reid, an influential MSNBC host, said that if Democrats win the Senate, they should commit to statehood for Puerto Rico and DC. Chuck Schumer on October 1st in 2020 said he would, quote, love to make Puerto Rico a state, along with DC. And now President Biden also voiced support for statehood back in September. So now that means that the current president of the United States, along with the Senate Majority Leader and other members of the Democratic Party and the media, are calling for Puerto Rican statehood based on the misleading headline that Puerto Ricans voted for statehood. We need to do more to educate the public and complicate this narrative. And this isn't about siding with any particular party in Puerto Rico necessarily. Some scholars don't want to appear partisan, and that's okay. I don't mind saying that I think that statehood is not a valid option for decolonization. Rather, statehood would be the culmination of US colonial rule over Puerto Rico. The expansion of the US settler colonial state into Puerto Rico will lead to even more displacement than we're already seeing. I support movements in the archipelago for an independent and socialist Puerto Rico, as did many of the students and activists that fought for Puerto Rican Studies, by the way. Even Bad Bunny came out against statehood, but folks don't need to go that far. Puerto Rican scholars and activists should at least be pushing back against the idea that the status issue is settled and that the referendum represents the will of the majority of the people. We should be pushing for an actual decolonization process as outlined by international law. There have been some important public interventions on other issues, including the recent trend of white American women pretending to be Puerto Rican. Hilda Jorens and Zaida Dincy Flores wrote a great piece on this, and the new executive board of the Puerto Rican Studies Association also issued an excellent nuanced statement just yesterday. Conversations on race, white supremacy, ethnicity, and identity are necessary, and I participate in them as well. But we need to do more on the decolonization question, on climate justice, and other issues facing Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and the archipelago. Puerto Rican Studies was founded in coalition with Black Studies and Black Liberation. As the Brooklyn College film shows, that legacy continues, and it's our job to carry it forward. I'll stop there for the sake of time, but thank you again very much for the organizers, and everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Amaka, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today with you virtually. Thank you, Connor, for inviting me to this panel or this program. And thank you to all my colleagues and comrades involved in the program. It's been amazing so far. So I'm happy to be here. I'm going to speak briefly about the adoption and the termination of open admissions in the senior colleges. Some of this comes from my book, but I'll just be speaking briefly, and then we can maybe have more of a conversation in the Q&A. But I wanted to start with just the founding of City College, which is the first municipal university in New York City, which was established in 1847, and more specifically, the mission of City College, which was to educate the children of the poor and the children of immigrants. So it's founded in the spirit, right, of an institution for the mass of people, not as this elite exclusive space, right? And I think that's important for us to think about as we move forward to even thinking about CUNY today, and also just reflecting on its history, right? Because even as this mass institution, it has been pretty exclusionary, right, throughout history, as it's mentioned multiple times today. So the CUNY system is consolidated in 1961, and by the 1960s, CUNY's senior colleges are still virtually all white. In 1964, I believe it's 2% Black, these senior colleges, in terms of student enrollment. And this is directly related to the inferior and segregated K through 12 education system in New York. It's a majority white ethnic system, and City College in particular is known for being a school that is composed of lots of Jewish students, which is in part related to the ethnic quotas practiced in the Ivy League in the early 20th to the mid 20th century. And so, City College, as well as the other CUNY schools, are known for being having a really excellent academic reputation, right? But they're still virtually all white by the mid 60s. SEEK is established in the senior college, right? The Search for Elevation, Education, and Knowledge program, and as well as college discovery in the community colleges. And the program's intent is to bring in more Black and Puerto Rican students into the system. And in part of this, and this was also sort of mentioned in the documentary, is that by identifying students who showed academic promise, but perhaps maybe their GPA didn't reflect this academic promise, this was a way in for Black and Puerto Rican students to come into the CUNY system, often in terms of the admissions process, by using the recommendations of teachers, community leaders, right, people from your church, whomever, who could vouch for your academic promise. SEEK becomes university-wide in 1966, though its biggest impact was at City College, where SEEK students were 6% of the student population by 1968. This is still a very small number, 6%. However, even though SEEK was a sort of avenue into the CUNY system, SEEK students did not have the full benefits of, and the sort of full, essentially, citizenship of students at the time. They could not vote in student government elections. They could not play on athletic teams. And so it is no surprise that it is these SEEK students who are the ones that lead the open admission strike of 1969. We know in terms of the Hunter College, or sorry, in terms of City College, student activists shut down the South Campus for 2 weeks in their occupation. And of their demands, 5 demands, we have the establishment of Black and Puerto Rican Studies, that Black Studies, Puerto Rican Studies, and Spanish language courses be required for education majors, that Black and Puerto Rican students get a separate orientation program, and that students be given greater power in the administration of the SEEK program. And importantly, that there is a proportional enrollment, that minority freshman enrollment reflects the 40 to 45% ratio of Black and Puerto Rican students in New York City high schools. This is an important piece in thinking about the policy that was eventually adopted. Before the open admissions strike, the CUNY administration had been working on establishing their version of an open admissions plan. They had planned to roll it out about 6 years later, which would have been in 1975. And this plan was to assign high school graduates to junior colleges. This is pretty typical when we think about community colleges nationwide and the admissions procedures that even persist until this day, right? That high school graduates could gain access to the community colleges, right? And so it's not a particularly radical or revolutionary kind of program, right? But in response to the '69 strike and the demands of activists and folks off campus as well, which is an important piece, the CUNY Board of Trustees adopted what we've come to know as open admissions at CUNY, which was that New York City high school graduates would be able to have access to the senior 4-year colleges, which of course were tuition free. CUNY was a tuition free, and city colleges were tuition free from 1847 to 1976, okay? This compromise was developed, or we can see it as a compromise or a concession, as a means to not alienate the white working class either, by doing the sort of demographic, the proportional enrollment. Remedial programs were central to open admissions. They're what granted access to the senior colleges. And I mention this because over the years, rather the language of ending open admissions, it was often the Board of Trustees and other kinds of institutions that centered on ending remediation, which would effectively end open admissions. We know that once open admissions is adopted, the demographics of CUNY transform. It becomes a majority minority system. And then we know that in response to the New York City fiscal crisis in the mid-70s and the austerity cuts that are made across social services, that tuition is instituted for the first time only about 6 years after you have any significant representation of non-white people in the system. So jumping to the 90s, open admissions is successfully terminated in the senior colleges in 1999. So by the 1990s, almost 75% of incoming students into the senior colleges needed at least one remedial class. And so the board, as well as other sort of figures and bodies, were complaining that remediation was costing the system millions of dollars every year. This is not uncommon. Even private selective institutions have remedial classes, and significant amounts of students, including wealthy students, middle-class students, have to take those remedial classes at more elite institutions. However, in this case, right, the cost of remediation in the face of declining state support of CUNY was a strategic way to eliminate the remedial courses in the senior colleges. We know also at the same time that the CUNY Board of Trustees is dominated by appointees of Republican Governor Pataki and Republican Mayor Giuliani, and they're aimed at developing a new strategic plan for CUNY overall that aimed to attract more middle-class students to the system as a way to get more tuition-paying students and higher tuition-paying students as a way to generate revenue. The Board of Trustees was also compromised by its connection to the Manhattan Institute, which is a neoliberal think tank that was hell-bent on privatization, that have published outwardly racist things about CUNY students, about ethnic studies, and was very public about the need to essentially, make CUNY great again, AKA when it was a majority white system with a particular academic reputation. The Manhattan Institute dominates, and representatives of the Manhattan Institute dominates the composition of the CUNY Advisory Task Force, which was established by Giuliani to develop an administrative agenda for the CUNY system. Now, by the way, developing an administrative agenda for a university system is something that Board of Trustees typically do. And so the Advisory Task Force recommended the end of remedial courses in the senior colleges, and the board adopts this, effectively ending open admissions. Students and faculty, of course, fight against this. And I talk more about that in my book. Ricardo had mentioned SLAM, right? There's lots of folks that are faculty and students that are aiming to fight this, but ultimately the board's decision is allowed to stand and open admissions is terminated. So briefly, I think it's important to center an understanding of movements and political conditions in the story of the adoption and elimination of open admissions. Grassroots movements from below are what forced the concession, right? That is open admissions, which transforms the CUNY system. This movement was successful in the context, I think importantly in the context of the 1960s, and was connected to other local grassroots movement activity. So it's important for me, at least, to highlight that it is not just enrolled students that are part of this struggle, right? This is a struggle that goes beyond the walls of the academic institution, right? And it was successful with the collaboration and participation of community members that were not students. The first blow to open admissions comes soon with the institution of tuition for the first time in the context of fiscal austerity, and throughout the neoliberal period, in which there is this waning commitment to ideas such as the public good, and instead cuts to social services and shared public benefits, education is a primary space that is targeted. It's no longer a space valued, sorry, my alarm. It's no longer a space valued for mass access as it once was, but instead a space of, debt and profit generation. And this is important in understanding the framing of the decision-making and the intention around the decision-making. Secondly, I don't think we can understand this decision-making that is occurring in the space of education in isolation of other political factors. We see clearly in the termination of open admissions that the organizations and the people prominent in this decision-making also have their hand in other forms of retrenchment, including privatization schemes, broken windows policing, cutting city services, critiques of progressive cultural politics, and more. And then finally, it was important for me to understand the attack on open admissions as not just a one-off decision, but tied to a larger strategic plan that was about remaking the CUNY system into one that was more profitable, that attracted a different kind of student and established it as an institution with a greater public reputation for success, right? Success in, air quotes. In my book, I talk about the attack on open admissions in relationship to attacks on affirmative action at elite public institutions. And one important difference here is that while attacks on affirmative action have little to do with larger issues of university governance and autonomy or changing the character of an institution, in CUNY, these changes appeared part of a larger plan in remaking the institution. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Amaka, thank you so much for that crucial presentation. And Anna will invite you to speak next. You have the floor.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see some of you on the screen and know that some of you are watching. I'm especially grateful to Connor for organizing this and just being here with other people who've been a part of CUNY activism and New York activism in different kinds of ways. It's really an honor to be here, so thank you. Okay. I need to try to share my screen. I'm going to show some pictures on a PowerPoint, and I have a link if people want to also find those slides on their own, but we can also share the screen if that works. Okay. Okay. Can people see this okay?
You're good, we can see it.
Okay, perfect, cool. So let me see. I think it may be easier if I just, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm just gonna start and leave it like this. I hope that's okay for people. And again, you can look up the different slides on your own device. Okay, so my research definitely builds on the previous talks that were happening and looks at CUNY, especially in the 90s. So where Professor Okechukwu left off is a great place for me to pick up. So my research especially focuses on student literacies. So I look at literacies as a very sort of broad idea that both thinks about things like pen and paper writing, as well as different kinds of creative and communicative practices that students adopted as, in this case, they were trying to fight intensifying budget cuts. So I was going to talk a little bit about sort of what was happening in the 90s, but I think Professor Okechukwu did a great job of doing that. But basically, there is this moment in 1999 when open admissions gets reversed officially as a policy, specifically through the defunding of remedial courses that would have allowed students who wouldn't have been admitted to the school otherwise to be there. And so what I just want to point out is that a really common tactic that was used was specifically, and then again, this is echoing what other people have said, but was specifically to target the literacy practices and the intelligence of students. So saying that they were unable to write or unable to, to really think. And so, sorry, I'm trying to share these slides as well. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so basically what I think some of my research helped to show is that this wasn't the only story of the 90s that was happening. So when I first became interested in histories of CUNY activism, this was basically the only story that I'd heard about the 90s, was that, the 70s was this really amazing time of student activism, and then everything just got bad, and the institution ran out of money, and the state didn't have enough money, and so open admissions ended. I think this is partially, this sort of focus away from the 90s has to do with the fact that, like, cultural critics often use economic critique as the sole way to understand what's happening at CUNY. And that means that there's sort of this very kind of linear downward arc, beginning with open admissions and kind of progressing negatively. So, it's really telling. There's been a lot of op-eds recently around the coronavirus in which, the CUNY system has been massively hit. There have been, CUNY has just faculty and students have been sick, they've died, and there have been a lot of different kinds of op-eds that have come up, sort of trying to defend CUNY. But what's interesting is that a lot of these kind of public articles often lament increasing budget cuts while failing to point out the not so coincidental fact that they corresponded with an increased presence of Black and Brown students and multiply marginalized students. And so, as was stated, tuition was only implemented at CUNY after the campus became majority Black and Brown. And there are these sort of ideas about this sort of golden age of CUNY, but I think what's not often, that we've gotten away from because we've become so underfunded, because we don't have enough money, et cetera. And what I think that a lot of these kind of public op-eds don't really say is that the CUNY that they lament was all white people, basically, and specifically white men, prior to the 1970s. And so looking at the 90s interested me because it reveals that there's sort of a near undercurrent of struggle and resistance happening by students after every single policy decision, basically, but also just happening on kind of its own timeline, and really thinking about the state of the city and the state of education in really brilliant ways. So these are some pictures from a protest called Shut the City Down, which was a rally against the latest round of budget cuts that were proposed by Governor Pataki in that moment. And I'd never really heard anything about 90s activism at CUNY when I first started researching this, but this was actually the largest student protest at CUNY after the open admissions protest. So there were 25,000 high school and college students there. Activists used a variety of tactics to spread news of the march and offer critique and attention to the budget cuts, but a key one they used was writing. So the images that I'm showing here are actually from a grassroots student publication called Spirit, which came up out of Hunter College, which was, and Spirit, among others, was affiliated with these various student activist groups that were mentioned before. So SLAM is one of them, CUNY Coalition is another. So one thing that's really important about these publications is that they lifted up stories that were either just sort of ignored by the mainstream press. You really can't find much coverage of these events except for certain kinds of special issues. or were actively suppressed. So what was especially suppressed, I think, and continues to be suppressed was the really intense police presence after this protest. So you can see in the image on the right that there's just really, really aggressive policing, which obviously still continues today. As someone who's seen that happen in activist settings, it's not great. So what I think was amazing about these publications is that they not only drew attention to what was happening in different kinds of policy cuts, but they also were connecting these policy decisions to what was happening in the world and what was happening in the city. So as an example, these are some demands that were disseminated in, again, sort of a DIY publication. These ones were by the CUNY Coalition Against the Budget Cuts that came, again, sort of in this context of the early mid-90s. So you can see here, they have these analyses about who's being targeted at CUNY, and they name that CUNY was and still is comprised of a majority of people of color and women, and most of these people work outside of schools. This is an analysis that often actually exceeds most understandings about austerity regimes in higher education, which often kind of offer, as I said, this sort of very general, non-specific, and somewhat race evasive and gender evasive ideas about what's happened to higher education. And so another thing that I think is particularly fascinating is that at the same time, these activists tend to center positionality and intersectional oppression as crucial to their movement very, very explicitly. And one thing that they do through their writing is that they critique objectivity. They critique the ways that objective, quote unquote, yet violent mainstream political and academic logics and rhetorics were used to silence them and justify austerity. So one example that was mentioned earlier was something like the culture of poverty, which was still kind of a logic that was really relied on in the 90s and was also, supported by data and scientific studies. And again, these think tank institutes were the ones behind this, the end of open admissions, and were also kind of using this very objective language. So these analyses actually don't just talk about policy or even sort of organizing in a narrow way, but are actually questioning knowledge itself and who has the right to speak, and how we might think about education as both about sort of admissions, but also about curricula and about ideas. So in other words, students offer a critique of narratives that are told by policymakers that rarely name race or really the role of any kind of systemic power structure, as well as the popular rhetoric that was very pervasive in the 90s around the culture wars that often framed higher education issues exclusively around issues around canon and which books are taught. And that sort of offered a very empty form of multicultural inclusion as the way to solve any kind of problems that were happening in higher education without acknowledging material conditions. So given those things, I sort of argue that we can't really understand these students' perspectives without acknowledging these organizers' indebtedness, or more accurately, interconnectedness with the rise of third wave feminism. So what I kind of want to say is that all of these kind of organizing demands that were happening were fundamentally feminist demands. So this might also make sense when we think about the context of the 90s. It was a really crucial moment in the development of critical race theory and women of color feminism. So one of the most kind of well-known theorizations that came out of that decade was Kimberly Crenshaw's formulation of intersectionality, and the publication of Patricia Hill Collins's Black Feminist Thoughts. And both of those were really thinking through, again, intersectional oppression, but also kind of who has the right to speak, and thinking about issues around standpoint that student activists were also bringing to attention. And of course, there were also faculty members at CUNY who were engaged in this kind of work. So Bell Hooks is one example of a faculty member in the 90s who was engaging in these questions too. But to be clear, what I'm suggesting is not that students merely read Bell Hooks or Kimberly Crenshaw and just applied their ideas, but what I want to say instead is that they were actively co-theorists in third wave feminism as a politics of education justice. So this becomes especially clear when we sort of expand what activism looked like at CUNY. So as one example, in 1998, a radical coalition of women and genderqueer students at Brooklyn College published their first issue of this zine called Ripe Guava. Its editor-in-chief, Zora Syed, collaborated with a network of other artists, writers, and activists at CUNY and beyond, and helped to foster a network of writers and artists on campus. So they published 3 zines, and these are the covers, through 2000. So while the issues of the zine contain a diverse array of essays and fiction and drawings, they have a bunch of different kinds of contributors. Their contents were unified by an explicit centering of women and genderqueer people, and particularly those who are also Black and Brown, as a recovery of their roots. And that's a quote from the editorial statement. So they offer a explicit critique of whitewashed feminism as a feminism that failed to address issues that are great concern to women of color. And so as a result, these editors wish to state that quite clearly that our focus will be women of color, although they have a multiracial group of people contributing, they are really explicit that that's what they're centering. So in this sense, Ripe Guava's attention to women of color through its thematic content, its demographics, and its citation politics is pointedly in response to the fact that the default perspective in the discursive and political realm of CUNY was white male subjectivity. And that's kind of what allowed, and sort of the logic that ended up kind of just privileging that perspective. And that's the very logic that allowed CUNY to basically have open admissions become reversed. So students were really actively critiquing that. So in this sense, Ripe Guava was asking about who gets to speak, whose voices are bolstered and prioritized, both in the world at large and pointedly in courses and in the physical space of Brooklyn College. And because their zine was based at CUNY, these zines and student writing interrogate the paradoxical ways that schooling reproduces intersectional oppression while also serving as a site of community and solidarity. And that's something that they're sort of reckoning with, it feels like to me, is talking about experiences, for example, of constant microaggressions in classes. A queer white student writes about her experiences with having a professor constantly use, for example, the first person plural we to refer to a group of students who look nothing like him. And that student also sort of extends her analysis to think about how multiply marginalized students are obviously even more severely impacted and were actively silenced by that professor in that case, which sort of speaks to the larger kind of critique that Ripe Guava is making. So the last thing I'll end with is just, I don't have time to read this whole poem, but one thing that I think is really fascinating is that students are actively connecting women of color feminisms and feminist struggles and the rise of third wave feminism with on the ground student activism. So some of the writers who were in this, who worked on this zine actually met each other at protests like the 1995 one and actively were writing about it and thinking about it. And their sense of community and working with the other writers and students really informed the way that they were thinking about education as a struggle and as a fight that wasn't necessarily linear, whether that was sort of a linear decline or kind of an overly simplified happy ending, but education was going to come out of struggle and solidarity. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that powerful presentation. We'll now get to hear a brief report from Sion Britton about a current campaign to transform admissions at the CUNY Graduate Center in Sociology. You've got the floor, Sion, and then after that, we'll begin our question and answer and dialogue session. So everyone get ready to contribute. Go ahead, Sion.
Thank you. First off, I want to thank everyone so far tonight, but especially those featured in the documentary that are here with us today. I just want to thank you for your example and all the panelists and the work that you're doing. It's really relevant to what I'm bringing up. So just want to thank you all for the legacy that you've left that is very much alive today. Thank you, Connor, and to the event planning committee for granting me some time to speak on this struggle that's happening right now within CUNY admissions. My name is Sion Britton, and I'm a third-year sociology PhD student. I'm a part of a collective calling for funding equity within the sociology department. In June 2020, a letter went out to our student body to demand funding for all sociology students at the GC. This letter now has over 100 signatures of sociology students and alumni. We have close to 50% of our faculty supporting our effort, but still currently lack the critical support from central line faculty. This letter stems from concerns voiced by students over the past few years, in which students are admitted with a funding package that includes tuition remission, a living stipend, and a graduate assistantship with salary, health insurance, and union representation. Other students, however, are admitted with only the tuition remission, in which they are responsible for securing full or part-time employment that may or may not include benefits, while still being expected to carry a full-time course load. Several students have shared their experience losing their job at the last minute and the personal and financial harms this situation causes. A two-tier funding system perpetuates white supremacy by designating traditional students as worthy of funding and risky students, especially Black and Brown students and those coming from within the CUNY system, as not worthy. Our research has found that students with only tuition remission take longer to complete their PhD and are more likely to drop out than students with full fellowships, and of course, due to competing priorities, not a lack of ability. Moreover, the department's practice of offering fellowships lacks transparency, consistency, and has at times been characterized as misleading by current and former students. Our struggle for funding equity also puts a spotlight on other issues of racism and elitism in our program's admission and selection cycles. There is an underrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people of color among students, compounded by a lack of Black and Indigenous people of color among faculty, and a reluctance to embrace an anti-racist curriculum and invitations to progressive guest speakers. We hope that our struggle within the sociology department will inspire change to happen at other levels of CUNY, in other departments at the GC, within the administration of the central office, and across CUNY campuses, including increasing the number of Black and Brown PhD students at the GC, which would directly increase the diversity of instructors in the CUNY system overall. I want to thank you all for your time and listening to our struggle. And if you want to learn more, please visit our website, which we have just placed in the chat. You can also email us with any questions if you yourself are seeking help to organize within your own department. And of course, if you have anything to contribute to make our organizing efforts even stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Sion. And as we saw in the poem that Anna had shown us, the struggle continues. And so thank you for linking the past to the present moment. So this is the time to really weave together all of these different lessons and inspired aspects of our shared history in CUNY in conversation. I want to encourage everyone to just take a moment to think about any kinds of questions or comments that you want to share. encourage you, feel free to put them in the chat like I just did. Or if you want to, you could just put your name down if you would like to jump on the mic to share some reflections. So we have people who have been involved in these struggles that we saw in the documentary. We have some current organizers in CUNY, student, faculty, and staff. And I really want to encourage us to use this time to think about how we can continue to transform CUNY by building upon these lessons. So again, any questions or comments for the filmmakers and for the presenters, feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to put your name in the chat so that I can call on you to share your thoughts on the mic.
So maybe something, I'll just drop this.
Sure.
So as part of my book research, I interviewed a bunch of people from Student Liberation Action Movement, SLAM, which I believe Anna spoke to a bit in her presentation. And so just so folks know that some of those interviews have been donated to the CUNY Digital History Project, as well as NYU's Tenement Library. So at some point they'll be accessible. So I just wanted to put that out there and also pick up on the, I was noticing, I was thinking about Lenina Nadal, who was involved in Student Liberation Action Movement, and her parents were in the documentary earlier today with the Puerto Rican Studies at Brooklyn College. So I just wanted to also acknowledge the generational CUNY activism there.
Thank you, Amaka. And I see Tami, if you'd like to share some thoughts, and want to encourage everyone who is in the audience. This is really a time for us to co-shape this discussion. So as Tami is sharing some thoughts, feel free to consider what you'd like to contribute as well.
I just wanted to, well, over the years at Hunter College, since I teach film and media, my students and I documented a lot of the struggles that have been going on throughout CUNY. So the march on the 23rd that was mentioned in one of the presentations, we had 5 people out in the streets filming the whole thing. Some of that footage you might have seen in the film. But I have enormous amount of material that I'd love someone to jump up and say, yes, let's make something with it. So I extend that as an invitation for any faculty, student, activist who really wants this material. It seems like it's in sync with Amaka's research and also with a lot of the material you have about SLAM, and much of the material is about SLAM. And we took over, the students took over the president's office, and all this is documented. So just so you know, there's a documented history, there's a long history of struggle. And as somebody who has been at Hunter for 33 years, I have witnessed the decline of Black students over these years. I have witnessed the decline of Puerto Rican students. I would say it's been probably 4 semesters since I've had a Black male student in my class. This is a crisis. And we need to bring this up, bring it forward, and try to figure out what the hell is going on. That's number one. The other thing that's a critical problem is that we have a dominance of white faculty, which I am one. I understand. I am talking about a united front of faculty, students, like we saw in Brooklyn College in 1969. We need the same solidarity to have affirmative action in place. We have to have Black and Latino and Asian faculty. It is a crisis at Hunter. It is an absolute crisis. And they constantly turn around and say, cutbacks, cutbacks, we can't hire. And we know that's not true. So I'm just putting that out. I'm putting out a lot. And to me, it's a crisis. What's happened. And I can only talk about Hunter College, but it is a crisis.
Thank you for naming that, Tami. And maybe to just build on that a little bit. So I got to hear in a few of the different presentations and in the film, this question of how any kind of transformation inside the university is not just created by the students, faculty, and staff, but very much has direct community input. And we also hear a lot of time that struggle is a teacher. And so I wonder if anyone who had participated in these struggles over the last 50 plus years could share about how these kinds of teaching and learning practices from the movement were brought into the classroom or in the creation of these departments. And if there are specific ways that we can also think about how the creation of Black studies, Puerto Rican studies, Latino studies, Asian studies, how they stayed accountable to the communities that they represented. So this is a question for everyone on maybe a more micro or granular level. How did the movement shape how these classes were being created or how CUNY was being transformed? So this is an open question. And I really want to encourage, even if it's just a memory, a reflection, or a thought that's in formation, the point is for us to share space to be able to share our thoughts here. So I encourage you to put some thoughts in the chat or some questions in the chat, or feel free to put your name down to be able to jump on the mic. And I see Albert has a question in the chat. How or what role do faculty retention, tenure, and promotion expectations affect transformative potential of departments, colleges, and universities? There's also some resources being shared. One meditation from a Brooklyn College student on campus activism in the age of Occupy. I see another question from someone that says they're very touched by the stories, also having a reflective, sad moment of inaction of their own ethnic group. How many Asian faculty are there at GC Sociology? And how can Chinese international students in humanities and social sciences achieve solidarity and make a difference? So that sounds like a question of coalition building as well. I wonder if any of our organizers over these last 50 plus years would like to reflect on this, how to build coalition across differences and among commonalities, and to think about, once creating these departments, how to retain them. So a couple of questions to be able to share outward. And Esther, I see you. Please go ahead. Oh, and please take yourself off mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Just to say that at the time in the 60s and 70s, we really, in some ways, you know, we were just young people, didn't know what we were doing. And it was very, very aspirational thinking. It was kind of an outrageous demand to say that we wanted to open up the college to everybody, regardless of an academic standing. Wasn't anything done before. And so I think that kind of aspirational thinking was so important in us being able to accomplish what we did. And now is the exact moment for that kind of aspirational thinking. So that the whole defund police movement and all that is very aspirational. It's like we don't have to know exactly every detail of what we want to be able to say, this is not working. This is not working, and we have to do something else. So, you know, one of the lessons that we learned at that moment in the 60s and 70s, that we can be audacious and people have the right to be audacious when things aren't working. So just that spirit, I think, that we had in the 60s and 70s, and I see again, that gives me hope. So be as aspirational as you possibly can be.
Thank you, Esther. I see a question from Raquel as well. How can CUNY Black and Latino Studies programs not only reflect or take up community struggles, but also contribute to these political projects? So we've got several questions that are up in the air. I want to encourage if the presenters, the filmmakers would like to share your thoughts, or anyone else from the audience. We've got a lot of wisdom in this space. Let's make use of it.
Can I jump in just to elaborate on my question a minute, Connor?
Please do.
Thank you. Yeah, I was struck in the film by the alumna who says, well, what do you do with a degree in Puerto Rican studies? Well, you become a teacher, you become a bilingual teacher. And I think many of us know that often in our quest for these goals, we are asked to justify what we're doing in very concrete ways. And that seems like a way that is both like really helpful for the community to have bilingual teachers, but then also allows this program to justify its own existence, which maybe it shouldn't have to. But so I'm wondering, is there a way that we can that these programs at CUNY can fulfill our own educational and intellectual pursuits, contribute to community political struggles at the same time? So I'm thinking that those kinds of specifics. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that clarification. I see you. Dr. Askia Davis, would you like to share some thoughts?
Well, when I was at Brooklyn College at 18, I actually ran the outreach program in Bed-Stuy for Brooklyn College, bringing in students from high school, getting them prepared for Brooklyn College. Also, by the time I was 20, BLAC, PRA, since I was a Panther, we started a breakfast program in Brownsville, Brooklyn, New York. And we also started a whole housing initiative in terms of dealing with the housing conditions in the community. So one of the things that I went on to do from Brooklyn College is I became senior assistant to 3 different New York City school chancellors. And it gave me a chance to really have a lot of impact on policy impacting 1 million kids in New York City. I was the first person to actually, under Ramon Cortines, set up a process for researching what was going on with Black and Latino kids in schools, high schools. They were not getting advanced mathematics and science courses. So one of the things that we did in 1993 is we became the first urban system in America to throw out all non-college preparatory math and science courses and to guarantee access to every kid in the New York City public schools to college prep math and science. So I think, then I also went on to become superintendent in Harlem, superintendent of schools in Harlem, and I retired after being deputy regional superintendent for 100,000 kids in the Bronx. So I think the thing that Brooklyn College did for me, it centered me on that idea of not just political action, but community service. I think the two things go together. And I look at Orlando, I look at Tony Nieves, and I look at the other people who were with us at that time, and I see their careers. And I say Orlando is still, I think he's retired, but he's still doing medical service in the Caribbean, and Tony. So I think, it's not just about what we do professionally, in terms of being isolated in like professional silos, but how do we get and use what we have to really begin to continue to transform the community. So when I look at the final thing I would say, in 1995, I was asked by Chancellor Crew to actually look at schools in New York City that were chronically failing year after year, mostly our kids. And so I wrote for Chancellor Crew, and it was adopted by the Commissioner of the State of New York, a design for closing schools that had chronically failed for 5 to 10 years, redesigning them. Actually, I negotiated with the UFT and the CSA the ability to dismiss teachers, to transfer teachers and principals to other places. We couldn't fire them, but it gave us a chance to rebuild and renew some schools. So I think it's just my example, but I know a lot of my friends have other examples. If you look at the presentations from last night, I think we had a sense of not just being students, but we had a sense of being a part of a broader community with our people.
Thank you for that contribution. And I'm seeing some more thoughts in the chat. Julia is asking the question of the history of how childcare centers were formed in CUNY, very much out of student and community movement work, and how these childcare centers factored into being defended, and in particular, how education students had related to them. Dawn is also bringing up that there's new funding from Project CUNY Social Practice. I want to add that there is additional funding in CUNY for the revitalization of ethnic studies. We have yet to see what the commission will be doing with this chunk of change, but this is an important question, how kinds of support that come from above may be utilized by movement-oriented participants in CUNY, or ways how to think strategically about that. There's also a question that Lauren asked, if there are any examples of transnational connections between student activists across the Americas, and thinking about a couple of the different examples, the University of Puerto Rico or in Chile. And so we've got several thoughts that are all kind of together. I wonder if Gisely, Pam, or Tami, if you would like to share anything, any remaining thoughts that are coming up, and then we can get to hear from Ricardo, Amaka, and Anna as we're closing for the night.
Sure. Something that's surfacing for me throughout the event, and throughout the lived experiences of teaching at CUNY and being a student at CUNY now at the same time again. And it links back to Esther's message, right? Just the belief of fearlessness, the belief that really the impossible is possible, right? To link back to the title of the film, and believe in that. And really, there's power in unity, there's power in collective action. So, find those networks, get in your community, start something, organize something, 2 to 3 people, and watch it grow. I just want to surface that, and really, that's one of the biggest messages that I'd like to leave with.
Pam or Tami, any concluding thoughts they all have?
Just really glad to hear all these stories and know that of the 100 people who are participating in this are all part of this larger struggle for educational equity and anti-racist and transformative education. So, and I hope that the film can aid in that effort.
I agree. I don't want to take any more time. I disagree. I just think, yep, we got a lot of work. Our students are active. We need to make connection with community and bring in faculty, get faculty involved as well, get full-time and part-time faculty involved, get staff involved, get the cafeteria workers involved. This is our mandate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, 3. And I wonder, Ricardo, Amaka, and Anna, if you have any thoughts, any of these loose threads of conversation, or things that are coming up for you in this moment.
I'll address Lauren's question very quickly. There was a panel at Rutgers University a few years ago commemorating the anniversary of Puerto Rican Studies at Rutgers. And there was a man named Gualberto Gil Medina who recounted being politicized through his exposure to student protests in Puerto Rico, led by the FUPI, the Federación Universitaria Pro Independencia. And his experiences in Puerto Rico motivated him to seek out other Puerto Rican students and form the Puerto Rican organization, once he enrolled at Rutgers Newark afterwards. And so the short answer is yes. And I also have data of key players in CUNY who were also either directly involved in or influenced by the FUPI struggle at the UPR. There were delegations from comprised of Young Lords members and members of the Puerto Rican Student Union that went to Puerto Rico to support the FUPI and other struggles at the university and in Culebra and Vieques. So yeah, that's one of the connections I'm trying to tease out in my work. And I think there's a lot of potential for those kind of connections in our current context as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just want to say thank you for everyone's participation and contribution. I think the one thing that's sort of sitting in my mind in reflection on a lot of what has been discussed is just the necessity to really think about essentially tearing down the walls of the university, right? That it is not an exclusive space, that it should be accessible to everybody, and that we should think of ourselves as members of a community and not just students, not just faculty, not just staff. And in that way, thinking more of a sort of continuum, right? So in what ways can we, better make this space open and accessible to folks in order to help them meet their needs, and vice versa? How can folks in the university better contribute, outside of the walls of the university? And that's all I'll say. Everyone has been great, so I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Connor, for all of your labor, and to the other speakers and the filmmakers. This was really, really amazing. And everyone who was here and asked questions and all that. One thing that I wanted to just say, and I think that some of the other talks in previous weeks and also the upcoming event as part of Connor's residency are going to obviously be about this, but there is a lot of really amazing activism going on right now at CUNY, including stuff around solidarity with faculty and with staff members. Some of it's a lot, there's always kind of things going on under the surface at a really, really small scale, obviously, like even in your own classrooms and stuff like that. But there are also people who are really organizing right now around different things. So like just an example that comes to mind is Free CUNY and other groups' involvement with the A for All campaign, which was, was and is a sort of campaign to get professors to give all students A's, both due to like all of the stress of the coronavirus and the really serious material challenges that it's placing on students, but also as a way to kind of question the entire logics of grades themselves in light of all the kind of activist struggles that we've been talking about. And so, yeah, and as we can see with the sociology program too, this is just, there's just all kinds of ongoing things that are happening. And to me, that's very, very exciting, so.
Thank you, Anna. So we very much got a movement download, a curriculum across the decades from these CUNY legacies. And I want to encourage everyone to please help circulate this film as broadly as possible. Please read this book that has been released to fulfill these rights, talking about the struggle of open admissions. And we are trying to look at these struggles from the 30s to the 60s and 70s, all the way up through the 90s, up to the present, to really help shape the future of the university today. And so the intention is to take this conversation and for it to fortify us in our ongoing strategies to free CUNY, to return open admissions, to expand ethnic and gender studies, and for us to do all that we can to decolonize and to liberate this university that we love so dearly. I want to give gratitude again to all of the speakers to Andrea and Brandon, our ASL interpreters for the night, to Sunny and Rachel and Helene, the Wendy's Subway tech team. The residency, our final event, will be on Friday, January 29th, with the theme Decolonize CUNY and NYC. We'll be featuring the American Indian Community House, Brooklyn College Anti-Racist Coalition, Free CUNY, the North Bronx Collective, and Rank and File Action. I encourage y'all to stay connected with Wendy's Subway on social media and at wendyssubway.com, where you can find more info about this residency, including a featured readings list for further studies. And if you wish to share this event recording or to view the first 5 events, you can go to Wendy's Subway's YouTube channel. But for now, I encourage you all, please take care, stay healthy, and let's continue the learning and liberation work out there. So thank you all again, and la lucha sigue. The struggle continues. Thank you all again.